The coin was a Liberty $50, worn smooth on the face from 30 years of passing between hands that needed it. Eliza Marsh had carried it in her left coat pocket since the morning she left Billings. 4 months ago, 2 stages and a mule cart. The last of everything she had been able to carry out of a life that had come apart at the seams. She had told herself the coin was for emergencies only. She had told herself that 17 times, once for each day she had been in Copper Falls, watching the doctor shake his head over the man in the back room of the livery, and listening to the town explain, in patient and thorough terms, why Hank Gideon was a lost cause. She had spent the coin that morning. She had given it to the boy at the apothecary for a half-pound of dried willow bark, a measure of camphor oil, and 2 yards of flannel bandage that she did not yet know what she was going to do with. The coin was gone. She had 11 cents left and no plan beyond the next 2 hours. She walked into the livery with her paper parcel and her 11 cents and the absolute, unreasonable certainty of a woman who has been right about broken things before. Before this story goes any further, if you have ever believed in something the whole town had given up on, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Because what Eliza Marsh does in that livery over the next 6 weeks, and what Hank Gideon does in front of the whole town of Copper Falls, Montana, it will change the way you think about what it means to see a person truly. She had arrived in Copper Falls in October with a widow's trunk, a widow's dress, and the particular invisibility that descends on a large woman of middle years when she is alone and carrying nothing of apparent value. She was 41 years old. She was big, had been big since girlhood, wide through the shoulder and substantial through the hip. The kind of woman who took up her full share of a wagon bench and had learned not to apologize for it. She had gray, beginning at her temples, and brown hair pinned back without fuss, and hands that were, by any objective measure, her most remarkable feature. Wide-palmed, steady, with the particular sensitivity in the fingertips that came from 20 years of knowing where to press and where not to, of learning the body's language of tension and damage and repair. She had learned that language first from her mother, who had kept a healing practice in a Missouri River town and who had trained Eliza the way a craftsman trains an apprentice, through repetition and correction and the slow accumulation of cases that could not be explained by what the medical books said and had to be explained by what the hands found. Eliza had practiced alongside her mother for 12 years and alone for 8 after, through a marriage to a decent man named George Marsh, who had died of a fever in the summer of 1882, and left her with a clean conscience, a paid-off house, and a neighbor who had decided, 6 weeks after George's burial, that the house belonged to him by right of an oral agreement with the deceased that Eliza had never heard and the deceased could no longer dispute. The legal proceedings had taken 14 months and had cost her the house, most of the savings, and whatever remained of her confidence in the goodwill of official bodies. What they had not taken was the trunk, the dress, or the hands. She had come west because west was where a woman with skills and no resources went when everything familiar was gone. She had heard about Copper Falls from a woman on the second stage, who described it as a growing town, with a doctor who was overworked and a population that had outrun the available medical knowledge. That had sounded to Eliza like a place that might need what she had. What she had not counted on was arriving to find that the one doctor in Copper Falls had strong opinions about untrained practitioners and expressed them publicly and at length. Dr. Stain was a small man with large authority and the particular territoriality of a man who has been the only expert in a room for long enough that he has forgotten expertise can arrive in forms he didn't certify. He had made his position on Eliza's presence clear within the first week, which meant that the families who might have hired her had been advised against it. And she had spent 17 days in a rented room above the feed store earning nothing. spending her reserves on food and shelter, and watching the Liberty half-dollar in her pocket grow heavier with the weight of last resort decisions. It was Mrs. Gruner at the boarding house who had told her about Hank Gideon, a rancher, 44 years old, who had been thrown from a horse 7 months ago and had landed across a fence rail in a way that had damaged his spine. Not severed. Dr. Stain had confirmed the cord was intact, but compressed in a place that had left him unable to stand, without the kind of pain that made standing not worth attempting. He had been in the back room of the livery, which his brother ran, since August. Dr. Stain had reviewed the case twice, and on the second visit had said, in the hearing of several people, that the damage was permanent and the most practical course was to help the man adjust to his limitations. Hank Gideon had been a working rancher. He had 320 acres north of the creek, good water rights, and a cattle operation that his younger brother Caleb was attempting to run in his absence with indifferent success. Before the accident, he had been known in Copper Falls as a man who was capable and quiet and somewhat solitary. Not unfriendly, but self-contained in the way that men who work alone tend to become self-contained, finding sufficient company in the work itself. He had never married. He had no children. When people in town discussed him now, they discussed him in the past tense. Eliza had listened to all of this in the kitchen of the boarding house over 2 evenings, and on the third morning she had taken the Liberty half-dollar out of her pocket and walked to the apothecary. The back room of the livery smelled of horse and hay and the specific staleness of a space that had been occupied by an unwell person for long enough that the air had given up trying. There was a cot against the east wall, a small iron stove burning adequately in the corner, and a man lying on the cot who turned his head when she came in and looked at her with the flat, conserving expression of someone who had grown accustomed to visits from people who meant well and could not help. "Eliza Marsh," she said. "I'm not a doctor." "I know every doctor in the territory," he said. His voice was level. Whatever pain he was in, he had organized it somewhere out of the way of his voice. "You're not any of them. I have some training in musculoskeletal injury. I've worked on damaged spines before. Not always successfully." She set the paper parcel on the small table beside the cot. "I want to look at where it hurts." He regarded her for a moment. He had a long face, angular, with the weathered skin of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors. His eyes were a dark, steady brown. The eyes of a man who was still, underneath the damage, a man who made assessments and acted on them. "Staten says it's permanent," he said. "Staten may be right," she said. "I want to look anyway." A pause. "What did that cost you?" he said, looking at the parcel. She did not answer that. "Will you let me look?" The pause was longer this time. 38 seconds. She had learned, from 20 years of practice, that the length of a person's pause before they allowed help was a measure of how long they had been refusing it. 38 seconds was not a very long time. "Look," he said. What her hands found, over the next hour, was not what Dr. Stain had described. The cord was intact. Staten had that right, but the damage was concentrated in a specific cluster of muscles along the left side of the lumbar region that had seized in response to the injury and had been seizing, without relief, for 7 months. The spine itself was compressed, but the compression was being held in place and worsened by the muscular contraction around it. A contraction that Stain, who was a physician trained in surgical intervention and not in the kind of slow, patient manual work that Eliza's mother had taught her, had either not identified or not known how to address. She did not say any of this. She set the camphor oil to warm on the stove and began. He did not make a sound for the first 20 minutes. For the next 10 minutes, he made a sound once. low and involuntary, when her thumbs found the place she had been looking for. Then he was quiet again, breathing with the deliberate control of a man managing something large. And she worked with the full attention of someone who is listening through their hands to a conversation the rest of the body is trying to have. When she was done, she wrapped the flannel bandage around the lumbar region in the specific configuration her mother had shown her for compressed injuries, not to immobilize, but to support while the surrounding tissue began to release. And she washed the camphor oil off her hands in the basin and sat down on the stool beside the cot. He was looking at the ceiling. "That's different," he said. "It'll be worse before it's better," she said. "The tissue has been contracted for 7 months. It won't release all at once." "How long?" "I don't know. I've seen worse come back in 6 weeks. I've seen similar take 4 months. I've seen some not come back at all." He turned his head and looked at her. "But you think it can?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I think it can." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the flat, conserving look he had worn at the start, but something that had more in it. A look that was asking whether she was the kind of person whose yes meant something. "Come back tomorrow," he said. She came back the next day, and the day after, and every day for the following 6 weeks. The livery had a wall that separated the back room from the main stable, and the wall had gaps in it wide enough to carry sound clearly in both directions. This was how Caleb Gideon, who worked the stable from before dawn, came to hear everything that happened in the back room each morning. Caleb was 28 and broad-shouldered and had the particular communicative quality of a man who processed his feelings by talking about them to anyone who would listen. Which meant that by the end of the first week, half of Copper Falls knew that a large woman with no credentials was treating his brother with camphor oil and flannel and her bare hands. Dr. Stain heard about it on the 6th day and arrived at the livery on the 7th. Eliza was in the middle of a session when he came to the door, hands engaged, Hank face down on the cot, the stove warm and the room smelling of camphor. Staten stood in the doorway and looked at the scene with the expression of a man who has found evidence of something he suspected. "I'll need you to stop," he said. Eliza did not stop. "I'll be done in 15 minutes, she said. "You're welcome to observe." "You are practicing medicine without a license in the territory of Montana." "I am practicing my mother's craft, which she learned from her mother, which has been practiced on this continent for longer than there have been licenses to practice it." She moved her hands 2 inches to the left. "You are welcome to file a complaint with the county. The county office is open Tuesday and Thursday." Staten looked at Hank, who had turned his head and was watching this with an expression that contained, for the first time in 7 months, something approaching entertainment. "Mr. Gideon," Staten said, "I strongly advise—" "She's almost done," Hank said. "Come back in 15 minutes. Staten left. He did not come back in 15 minutes. He came back the following Tuesday with a letter from the county medical board advising Eliza that she was to cease all medical treatment of patients in Copper Falls under penalty of a fine she could not pay. The letter was delivered to her rented room above the feed store, where she read it once, folded it, and set it on the table. She went to the livery the next morning at the regular hour. She had weighed the risk, and the risk was real. The fine, the humiliation, the confirmation of everything Staten had been saying about her. She had also weighed what her hands had been finding each morning for 3 weeks, which was measurable change in a specific direction. Less contraction, more release. A man who had been flat on a cot, since August beginning, with effort, to sit at the edge of it. She had made her accounting, and she had gone back. That was all there was to it. By week 4, Hank was sitting upright for 2 hours at a stretch. By week 5, he had tolerated standing for the first time, not without pain and not for long, but standing. His grip on the wall was white-knuckled, and his breathing was loud, and he stood for 45 seconds before he sat back down. And when he looked at Eliza, his face had something on it she had not seen there before. "Again tomorrow," she said. "Again tomorrow," he said. By the end of the 6th week, he was standing for 8 minutes at a time, walking the length of the back room with one hand on the wall, and then without it. It was not the walk of a well man. It was the walk of a man learning again what he had once known, finding the old instructions somewhere in the body's deep memory, and following them with great deliberate care. But it was walking. No one outside the livery wall knew yet. Caleb knew, because Caleb heard everything through the wall. And Caleb had told 2 people. But those 2 people had heard that Hank Gideon was not well, and the claim that he was walking was a claim they had sorted into the category of wishful interpretation. Dr. Steen had sent a second letter about the fine. Eliza had folded it and set it beside the first one. The midpoint trouble came on the 38th day, when Mrs. Gruner at the boarding house told Eliza, in the apologetic tone of someone delivering unavoidable information, that Dr. Steen had spoken to the owner of the feed store, and the owner of the feed store had spoken to the owner of Eliza's room, and the room's rent would be doubling at the end of the month. Not because of the market, because of a conversation. Eliza sat with this for one evening. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the systematic removal of her footing, one board at a time, by a man who was frightened of what her hands could do. She sat with it until she had felt all of it, and then she got up and set the room in order and went to bed, because there was work in the morning and the work was the point. The next day, she went to the livery and told Hank. He listened without speaking. Then he said, "How much is the new rate?" She told him. "Move your things to the ranch house," he said. She looked at him. "Caleb is there?" he said. "It's proper enough. And the road from the ranch to town is shorter than the road from the feed store." He said it the way he said everything, plainly as a logistical observation, with no theater in it. "Besides," he said, and there was the faintest quality in his voice that she had come to recognize as the place just before dry humor, "you've seen everything there is to see of me. Moving your trunk doesn't change the accounting." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. It was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of December when Hank Gideon walked into the Copper Falls General Store. He had not been in the store since July. He had not been in any building in Copper Falls since August, except the livery. And most people in town had last seen him horizontal. He walked in through the front door in the middle of the afternoon with a cane he was using more for the room's benefit than his own. He had stopped needing it for balance the week before. But he had agreed with Eliza that arriving without it would be a larger shock than was productive. And he walked to the counter with the particular deliberate pace of a man who is not rushing, because rushing would imply there was any question about his right to be there. The store had 6 people in it. The 6 people had the collective response of 6 people watching something they were told was impossible become possible in real time. The kind of silence that is not shock so much as recalibration, the mind catching up to the eyes. Dr. Steen was there. He had come in for sulfur powder and was standing at the far end of the counter, and he turned when the door opened, and he stood very still. Hank walked to the counter and asked for 30 pounds of winter wheat seed and a length of good rope. He did not look at Staten. He did not look at anyone in particular. He was a man buying supplies, which was what he had always been, and the intervening months were relevant to no one's business but his own. Eliza was at the door. She had not come in. She was standing in the open doorway with her coat on and her hands in her pockets, watching. She had been there when he decided to come today. She had not told him when or whether to. That was his to decide, and he had decided, and she had walked beside him into town without commentary. Now, she stood at the door and watched the room recalibrate. Staten set down his sulfur powder. He looked at Hank, and he looked at the door where Eliza was standing, and something moved across his face. Not a large thing, but visible. Not an apology? Not quite. More like the look of a man who has been wrong in public and knows it, and has not yet found the configuration of himself that allows him to say so. He picked up his sulfur powder and walked toward the door. He stopped when he reached Eliza. He looked at her for a moment, at her coat, at her hands, at the 11 cents and nothing she had started with, and the 6 weeks she had spent in a livery room every morning while he sent letters about fines. She met his eyes without expression. She had learned a long time ago not to give men like Staten the satisfaction of her reaction in either direction. "What did you use?" he said, low, so only she heard it. Not an accusation. A question. The question of a man who actually wanted to know. "Willow bark for the inflammation," she said. "Camphor for the deep tissue. Manual compression and release of the affected musculature twice daily. Sustained pressure at the contracture site." "Samtit sas fabuatashna," she paused. And I listened. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked out. It was not an apology. It was not a retraction. The fine letters remained on the table in her room at the ranch house, unresolved. But it was a man who had spent 2 months trying to remove her footing, asking, at the end of it, what she had done. And it was a question, not a dismissal. She considered it sufficient for the moment. Behind her, the store had come back to life. The particular resumed hum of a room that has witnessed something and is now deciding what to make of it. She could hear Hank's voice at the counter, unhurried, asking about the condition of the winter wheat supply. She could hear the storekeeper answering in the tone of a man making conversation with someone he is quietly relieved to be making conversation with again. She stood in the doorway in the December cold and breathed the cold air and let herself feel, for a moment, what she did not allow herself to feel most of the time. That she had been right and had spent everything on being right. And it had been worth it. The county medical board's fine was formally withdrawn in January, after a petition signed by 23 Copper Falls residents was submitted to the board's office in Helena. Caleb Gideon had started the petition and had, characteristically, told everyone in town about it while gathering signatures, which meant that the process of its creation had been approximately as public as the event that inspired it. Dr. Steen did not sign the petition. He also did not oppose it. He had requested, through a mutual contact, a meeting with Eliza in February to discuss what she knew about musculoskeletal contracture. She had agreed to the meeting. She arrived with her mother's notes, which she had carried in the bottom of her trunk through 2 stages and a mule cart all the way from Billings, and which she set on Staten's desk without preamble. "Take what's useful," she said. He had taken 3 hours to read them and had asked 17 questions. She had answered all 17. It was not a friendship. It was a working arrangement between 2 people who respected, cautiously, what the other could do. The ranch ran better in the spring. Hank was not yet the man he had been before the accident. His back gave him trouble in the cold, and would, she thought, for the rest of his life. Which she had told him plainly, and which he had received without drama. But he was working. He was out on the land each morning at first light, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had come back to something from a long distance and had learned, in coming back, not to take any of it for granted. One evening in April, he came in from the south pasture and found her in the kitchen with her mother's notes spread on the table, copying passages into a clean journal she had purchased in town. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment, the way he had a habit of watching things before he spoke about them. "I want you to stay," he said. Not for the first time, and not the last, but said this time with a specificity that the previous times had not contained. Not as the woman who fixed my back. As the woman who spent her last coin on a man the whole town had written off and turned out to be right about it. Astanima sauce. She set down her pen. She looked at him in the April evening light coming through the kitchen window. This man she had spent everything on, who had given her back everything she had spent and then everything besides. I intend to stay, she said. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her, and the notes were between them on the table, and the spring outside was doing what spring in Montana does, arriving late and golden and with no apology for its lateness. And the creek was running high, and somewhere in the willows along the bank, something was beginning that had been waiting out the whole long winter. She had been told, in one way and another, for most of her 41 years, that a woman her size was too much to look at and too little to credit. She had spent the last of what she owned on a man in a livery room, and had been threatened with fines, and had moved her trunk to a stranger's ranch house, and had kept going back every morning because the work was the work and the work was what she was. She had not waited to be given permission for any of it. She had looked at a broken thing and seen what it could be, and she had put her hands on it and listened, and it had stood. That was the whole of her. That was the whole of it. And it was, by any honest accounting, more than enough.